Ladies and gentlemen, I have 5:30, and we like to start on time, and more importantly, end on time. So why don't we go ahead and start the proceedings? So let me welcome all of you with us today to the Baylor University Free Enterprise Forum. It is March the 9th, and we're going to be discussing the Texas electricity system, a very timely and important topic. Um, as all of you know, especially if you're local here with us in Texas, we had a sort of catastrophic weather event last month, which left lots of Texans without power, some without water, very serious problem. And now that the temperatures have returned to sort of what they would normally be this time of year, I think we were in the low 70s here in Waco. A lot of folks are asking, what happened, what went wrong, why did so many people lose power? Here we are in the 21st century with all our advanced technology, and Texas is supposedly luring all of these tech companies from California and elsewhere because of our great business-friendly environment. Well, if we can't provide basic infrastructure, including electricity, during the wintertime, well, then that's going to be a problem for this state. So now that we have had a little bit of distance and most of the repairs have been done and some of the disruption is over, people are asking a lot of questions. What happened? What went wrong? What can we do to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? Even in the midst of the crisis, of course, folks were taking advantage of the situation to promote favored political positions. So people who think that the Texas electricity market isn't regulated enough immediately concluded that the problem was too little regulation. People who thought that there was too much regulation, or rather too much regulatory emphasis on renewables and especially solar and wind power, thought that over-reliance on those energy sources was the cause of the problem. People noted that the Texas electricity grid is not connected, or only a little bit connected, to the two major U.S. electricity grids. Why is that? Texas is a big state. Texans like to do things their own way, but it seemed a little odd that the system is not as interconnected as it could be. Is that solely because Texans don't want to be subject to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulation? Lots of people in Texas now know the acronym ERCOT. People who had never heard of ERCOT before now know what ERCOT is. Did ERCOT fall down on the job? Or was this simply an unforeseen natural event that could not have been anticipated and really could not have been, there's little that Texas could have done to prepare? Those are the kinds of issues that people are talking about. We want answers. Well, fortunately tonight, we have an expert panel that will provide us the answers to those questions. Before I introduce the panelists, let me introduce myself and tell you more about our venue. My name is Peter Klein. I'm a professor at Baylor University's Hankamer School of Business. I'm also chair of the Department of Entrepreneurship and Corporate Innovation and the academic director of the Free Enterprise Program at the Baugh Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. And one of our activities at the Baugh Center is our Free Enterprise Forum lecture series. And so tonight we have two speakers in a panel discussion presenting their views on the Texas electricity system and why the Texas electricity system failed as part of our Free Enterprise Forum. If you'd like to know more about our programs at the Baugh Center, you can just type the words Baylor Free Enterprise into your favorite search engine. I won't tell you which one to use. And you can learn more about our research, teaching, and outreach activities in the area of entrepreneurship and free enterprise. Our mission is to provide a better understanding of the free enterprise system, to encourage research and teaching and public engagement on how to make the free enterprise system better. And our Free Enterprise Forum is a major part of that initiative. So as I mentioned, we have two distinguished guests tonight, and I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. First is Lynne Kiesling. Lynne is a professor in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, where she also co-directs the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics and is a faculty affiliate at the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. I've had the privilege of knowing Lynne for many years. She's an excellent researcher, teacher, and speaker on issues related to regulation in general, but in particular, the economics and law of electricity markets, so-called smart grid economics. She's also an expert in market design and retail competition. Lynne has a PhD in economics from Northwestern University, where she studied with the great economic historian Joel Mokyr. She's taught at Northwestern as well as Purdue, King's College London, and the College of William and Mary. And Lynne blogs at knowledgeproblem.com, which I encourage you to visit often. Our second speaker is Craig Pirrong. Craig is professor of finance and director of the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute, or Energy Markets Director of the Gutierrez Energy Management Institute, all at the University of Houston. Craig received a PhD in business economics from the University of Chicago, where he also taught, as well as teaching at the University of Michigan, Washington University St. Louis, and Oklahoma State University, where he was the Watson Family Professor of Commodity and Financial Risk Management. Craig's research focuses on the economics of commodity markets, with special emphasis on electricity, particularly timely for our discussion tonight. And Craig also blogs at streetwiseprofessor.com, which I also encourage you to visit. So Lynne and Craig, welcome to the Free Enterprise Forum at Baylor University. I've asked each of our speakers, we'll do Lynne first and then Craig, to give us 20 to 25 minutes of prepared remarks on what they think happened last month here in Texas and what we might do to avoid a recurrence of this sort of event. And after that, we'll have I'll ask each one to comment briefly on the presentation of the other, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So this is a webinar style Zoom session. So our audience members, if you would please type your questions into the Q&A window, I'll then read those questions for our panelists at the conclusion of our session. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Lynne Kiesling.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. And thank you for organizing this event. It is very timely, and I have to say a lot of my attention, I'm the only one here who is not in Texas, but you'd be surprised, given that I'm not there, how much of my time has been focused on Texas for the past few weeks. I think it's important to say from the outset that one of the big things that we learn from events like this is how much we do rely on our built infrastructure, and that that this had certainly had dimensions of tragedy with some lost lives and some lost property and lots of discomfort. So the magnitude of the questions that we're talking about here, I think, is really high and really important. And so I appreciate, Peter, I appreciate you organizing the forum so that we can talk about this and hopefully shed some light on what is a very complicated, interconnected and interdependent system. And for me, that's going to be the big punchline. So I'll start with the punchline and then we can build to it. That a lot of people, we just think about electricity as I flip the switch and the light goes on and don't give it any extra thought. As long as I can charge my phone, I'm fine. The complexity of what goes into making that happen is really astounding, and it is a marvel of modern engineering. The electric system is considered one of the engineering marvels of the 20th century. And I say I'm not an engineer, even though I'm in an engineering department. I am an economist, but I think I've picked up a little bit of the engineering along the way. So my remarks, I'm going to talk about the kind of the institutional framework in which the electricity industry operates, some of the operational aspects of what actually happened in mid-February, and then kind of put the factors on the table that combined, and there has been a lot of finger pointing and kind of politically motivated or ideologically motivated reasoning going into the kind of post-event analysis. And I'm going to caution against that. Okay, so to start off with all of that, this industry has a 130-year history, and the 130-year history really is, goes back to Thomas Edison, who did more than just invent what we think of as inventing the light bulb. There were like 15 people who invented the light bulb. He's the one that got the patent, but most importantly, he's the one who conceived of the production and delivery of electric lighting as an integrated system. And so from the get-go, this has been what in economics we call a vertically integrated industry, where all of the different parts of the supply chain, in this case electricity, is the generation of the current, the transportation of the current across the wires network into your home, where you flip the switch and the light goes on. And so that's always, from its origins, it was technologically integrated into a single system. And that was part of Edison's design. There were a lot of other really spectacular innovations that went on in the late 19th and early 20th century that contributed to electricity becoming not just a novelty as a way to provide lighting, but indeed grew to power entire industries. So what used to be belt-driven motors with steam engines now became, industries that use electric motors to produce stuff. And so over the early 20th century, you get this big transition of powering industry and powering what goes on in our homes using electricity rather than the alternatives. One of the reasons for that is that, especially in those early days, electricity had a lot of what in economics we call economies of scale, which basically means you can produce a lot of output for a very, very low average cost per unit of output. And the way to think about this, or the representation of this, is when you see like a power plant or the turbines that are what generate the electricity in the power plant, they're usually huge, 6 feet tall or bigger. And that represents, to me, that kind of symbolizes the fact that this industry grew because of its economies of scale. It also had economies of scope. So I've been saying a lot of the word lighting. The origins of the industry were to provide lighting, an electric alternative to gas lighting or candles or a kerosene lamp. And so in the early days, lighting was the main product. And that was, like electric lighting was like the iPhone of the 1880s. That was the thing to have. And an enterprising guy in Chicago, Samuel Insull, kind of looked around and he said, I've got all this generation capacity and all these wires, and during the day when we don't need lighting, it's just sitting idle. So he went to the Chicago Transit Authority because he knew they were thinking about electrifying the trains. And he said, rather than you building a generation station and doing it yourself, making your own electricity, how about if you buy it from me? I'll give you a good price. And that way he's using his assets throughout the whole day and not just when you need lighting. And that's called economies of scope, where you use your assets to produce two different types of products. So those two things combined led to the most economical way to produce electricity being big companies, big firms. And this is the progressive era. There's a lot of concern about market power and monopolization. And there are also some other reasons why the industry was totally fine with taking on board state public utility regulation. But all of these forces kind of converged in the 1907 to 1930 period, and state public utility commissions were established to regulate these big electric utilities, quote unquote, in the public interest. And that's the legal phrase that's the most important thing here, that since electric utilities are providing this service in the public interest, the regulatory bargain is you, electric utility, will have a monopoly over selling electricity in a particular area. And in return for that monopoly, you're going to have to serve everyone who moves in, and you're going to have to accept some regulation of the prices that you can charge. And so that's the origins of regulation. It starts at the state level. And so electric utilities start as being contained within the state. And of course, most states are smaller than Texas. And so Texas being large and then having, you know, a lot of economic growth, there were many utilities that grew within Texas. And because Texas is big, once you start you know, building out these utilities, you want to have some kind of contractual relationship in case stuff goes wrong, right? So say one of your generators goes out unexpectedly, you want to be able to pick up the phone and call the person at the utility next door and say, hey, can you send me 20 megawatts at 4 o'clock this afternoon? And so they evolved these contractual relationships to enable each other to have this kind of backup interconnection across the utilities. And in Texas, that's all done within the state of Texas. And you know, but in other places, like in Chicago, which corners onto Indiana, or like New York, New Jersey, those kind of relationships are going on across state lines. And so in the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, you get federal regulation, federal jurisdiction coming in as essentially under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Once you have contracts and commerce crossing state lines, then the federal regulator can come in. And what the Federal Power Act enabled what's now the FERC to do is to ensure that those transactions occur at prices that are, here's the other term of art, just and reasonable. So we have utilities acting in the public interest, but being regulated to make sure that the prices that are charged at wholesale for things like wholesale bulk power transactions, or the rates that you charge for people to use your transmission lines to send their power, that those are just and reasonable. So that's the landscape of where utility regulation is. And then we can fast forward to, you know, so there's construction and growth. And by the 1960s, we essentially have universal electrification in the country, which is a remarkable accomplishment. And the policy objectives throughout the 20th century were for electric service to be reliable, affordable, and safe. And those were the most important objectives throughout most of the 20th century. Then we fast forward to the 1980s, and there's some, you know, engineer at General Electric who's working on a new turbine for a jet engine for a plane. And, you know, he's tweaking it, and he kind of looks at it sideways one day and says, you know what, if we bolt this to a platform and we, you know, basically stick it to something that's generating steam, we can use this to generate electricity. And it was at a much smaller scale, you know, not the huge coal-fired power plants that we had before. And this change in the economies of scale opened up the opportunity for having competitive wholesale power markets. And that's really where the story of ERCOT starts. ERCOT is formed, I believe, in 1989, and it's one of several what are called regional transmission organizations within the US. And ERCOT, it stands for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And what ERCOT's mission, it's a nonprofit corporation, and it's regulated by the Public Utilities Commission of Texas. And its job is very much to maintain the system reliability at the high voltage transmission level. And after this jet engine on a platform innovation made competitive markets possible, ERCOT became the wholesale market platform. And so they maintain a competitive wholesale market and all of the other markets that are associated, because you don't, when you're selling electricity and you're delivering electricity, there's all sorts of other stuff you have to do to get the engineering to work. And so there's markets in some of those things as well. ERCOT ensures that all of the participants in the market have open access to the transmission grid, and they help to facilitate the retail market. Texas is unusual in the US in that since the late 1990s, with regulatory restructuring, Texas is, in my opinion, the only truly deregulated electric industry in the country, because Texas successfully and, in my opinion, accurately did what in competition policy we would call quarantining the monopoly. Right? The wires network still has some of those economies of scale and network characteristics that make a single provider make the most economic sense, but you have competitive generation in a wholesale market, and you have a whole bunch of competitive retail service providers that's potentially competitive. And so the Texas legislation said, regulate the wires, everything else is competitive. And so ERCOT facilitates a competitive retail market by providing information and enabling retail energy service providers to buy power in the ERCOT wholesale markets. So so that's what ERCOT's role is. ERCOT does not operate generation. They do not have any contractual relationships with residential or commercial or industrial customers. They are a market platform, and they are the grid operator. And so those are two very fundamental and important roles for understanding what happened in February. So what happened in February, right? We're chugging along, and you know, the ERCOT market has a lot of beneficial features. I would argue that the ERCOT market is probably one of the best designed electricity markets in the world, which doesn't mean it's perfect, right? No designed human institution is going to be even close to perfection, and you know, can't have the foresight to be able to anticipate what kind of outages. So there's always going to be risk, and I'm going to leave risk to Craig to talk about, because that's his comparative advantage. But let's talk about what actually happened. So Peter, do you want to pop up that picture? I have a busy but informative picture that that I got off of Twitter. Thank you, Brian Bartholomew, whoever you are. This is a busy but informative encapsulation of what happened between February 11th and February 19th. Right. So first, what happened on February 11th and 12th. So the first 2 days represented here, and I should say the lines on here, the black line is actual load, so actual demand. The gray line underneath it was the forecast demand. Right. So one of the things that ERCOT always does is they have this long range planning they do where they forecast what the demand is going to be so that they can go out and ensure that there's going to be sufficient supply to meet that demand. On the red line is the thermal plant, which is natural gas or coal-fired power plants. I don't think nuclear is involved in that. I think that's just thermal and coal fire, or natural gas and coal-fired power plants. And the red line shows the plants that were out. So when you had plant outages, that's what that red line represents. And then at the bottom, the blue line is the production, the actual quantity produced by wind and solar. Right? And so that's what's going on in this graph. So if we start at the left, February 11th and 12th, there's a big ice storm. And it's a large and fairly unprecedented storm in the sense that it covered the entire state. It also covered the southern Midwest, right? Arkansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Iowa, I believe as well. And it's very cold across the entire state for much of the whole week, right? Because usually I think, when there's winter storms, you'll have it be cold for 2, maybe 3 days. But this was an entire week of unprecedented length of very, very, very low temperatures. Over the course of this, almost half of the generation capacity, the ability to supply electricity, at one point or another was lost or unavailable. The extended power outages plus icy roads meant that there were a lot of people who didn't have power for a long time, so the the temperatures in their homes went down to freezing or close to it, which means burst pipes. So we have, the effects in the water system. So in terms of timing, and I just want to touch on this briefly, and then we can get rid of the graphic. But in terms of timing, the important thing to look at is that overnight, that Sunday night between the 14th and the 15th. So there's an ice storm. It's really cold. You can see that demand, the black line, demand is really high. And usually in Texas, when we think about high demand, we think about those 100-degree days in the summer. We don't really think about planning for winter residential heating demand. But that's what we have in these first 4 days. And then in particular, that Sunday night, it was really cold. So the heat's still running in people's homes. And you can see that there are some natural gas plant outages, the red line there. Typically what happens is these power plants have to go offline for annual maintenance. And usually that's scheduled in the winter, because in the winter is not when the demand is. Usually the demand is in the summer. So some of these are offline for maintenance, but then this heat, the demand for heating stays high. And at about 1:30 in the morning, Sunday night, a bunch of these power plants they trip off. And this is going to be part of what the forensic engineers are going to investigate. What had happened, why did it happen? And so where that gray line is, where you can see the red line shoots up, that's where power plants are turning off. One thing that happened, and I think this is really important, one thing that happened is that there were natural gas power plants that were willing to produce and able to produce and ready to produce, but they couldn't get the gas. And there's 2 reasons they couldn't get the gas. One was home heating gets priority. So for residential customers who have gas heat, the gas gets delivered to them. And that reduces the supplies available to the power plants. Number 2, the gas supply itself was really restricted because there was freezing in the gas production from the wellhead to the burner tip, right? So when natural gas comes out of the ground, it comes out of the ground with a bunch of stuff, including water. It was freezing. There are, mechanical parts of the gas supply system that were freezing. And so there are power plants that could have produced if they could have gotten gas, but they didn't get gas. And so you have all of these outages, and they are piling up at 1:30 in the morning that Sunday night. And so what happened at this point was, and this is the important engineering, is there was a very big frequency drop, right? Because in alternating current systems, the current goes like a sine wave. And so the sine wave has a shape, has a frequency. And when frequency is what tells you the management, the balance between supply and demand. And supply and demand is supposed to stay in a balance at all times in order to maintain the stability of the system. A frequency drop tells you demand is a lot higher than supply. And so in order to reestablish that balance, you have to cut some demand. And so that's where you see that big drop at 1:30 in the morning. And that was ERCOT making the operationally correct and appropriate decision to what's called shed load, to reduce demand by creating outages. So that was a cold Monday, and a cold and dark Monday. And so you see that load plummets below the forecast as these blackouts begin. Notice that the plant outages are continuing through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So the natural gas plants aren't really starting to come back online until Thursday. And so actual demand is below the forecast demand because of the rolling blackouts to maintain the balance in the system. Also notice that wind and solar wind and solar are expected to perform, to produce a certain amount of power in the winter. And in general, they pretty much almost met those expectations. They were a lot closer to meeting those expectations than the gas power plants in terms of ERCOT's forecast. Okay, Peter, I think we can dispense with the graphic. So the picture so far, right? There's upstream gas supply problems because of lack of winterization in the fuel supply. There's lack of winterization at power plants, but this is an unprecedented event. And so one important question that I think we have to grapple with, and this is where I really am gonna, I think, turn it over to Craig, because this is in his wheelhouse, that this is an unprecedented event, and I don't think we could have foreseen the depth and the length, the duration of it. But it raises a lot of important institutional design questions about things like how much do we want to spend to, weatherize to such low temperatures when these low temperatures happen very infrequently. And then the next question is, how infrequently are they going to happen, right? If one of the manifestations of climate change is the increasing variability in weather patterns, are events like this really going to be as infrequent as they have been historically? And it's hard for us to know that, right? That's definitely an unknown. And so it's hard for us to plan for that. But I think the issues here are energy systems issues. They're not particularly market design issues. And we can talk more in the discussion about what happened in ERCOT in terms of the market, the price cap, things like that. But I think what I am taking away from this is the importance of the energy system issues in the interdependence between the natural gas supply system and the electric system as a whole. And that there are certain things that we could do that I would call kind of low-hanging fruit, which would be things like focusing on the very large share of the residential housing stock in Texas that is not very well insulated. And that doing things like, and especially for if we're thinking in terms of wanting to ensure that things like this don't harm low-income and vulnerable people, if you're looking for somewhere to focus some kind of government policy, finding a way to do quality energy efficiency is where I would focus, rather than things like more regulation from the Public Utilities Commission or less emphasis on markets. The other thing that, and Peter mentioned this, is this idea of interconnection, right? And I told the history about the origins of ERCOT for a reason, right? That all of these systems started in a very bottom-up way. And Texas is a big enough state that for 99.9% of the time, the risks, the weather-related risks across the state are not necessarily very correlated with each other. So for 99% of the time, Texas is ERCOT is a big enough system to be able to, in essence, self-insure. But even if they had better interconnections with the other grids in the rest of the country, This was a big enough storm that the surrounding states were also really suffering outages and very cold temperatures as well. So interconnection is not going to be a panacea here, but it's certainly on the table for something to discuss in terms of the institutional design as we go forward. And I'm going to stop there and leave all the hard stuff for Craig to discuss.
Lynn, thank you very much for an excellent overview of how the system works, because many of us, again, we flip the switch, the light comes on. We don't think that much about how complicated is the system from an engineering point of view, as well as an economic and financial point of view. And it's very useful to get that overview as we start to think about what possibly could have been done differently, if anything, to avoid the kinds of problems that we had in February. So with that, let me hand it off to Craig and ask him to share his perspective on what happened and what we could maybe change.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and also thank you to Lynn, because made my job a little bit easier there by really setting the table and laying out a lot of the issues. So let me, basically what I'm going to talk about is first, looking at what happened, building a little bit on what Lynn said, and then also sort of look forward a little bit in terms of what lessons should we learn and what lessons shouldn't we learn, and what are some of the other issues that we shouldn't lose sight of going forward. Because there can be a tendency when you have an extreme event like this to have it become so dominant in your thinking that you don't address other issues that can be get up and bite you sometime in the future. So one remark that I would make is leveraging off what Lynn said was the interconnections here and how important that is in terms of understanding what happened, but also the risks of that happening. To emphasize, I mean, first of all, the electricity system is interconnected and it has to be retained in balance, essentially on a real-time basis. Essentially, consumption has to equal production all the time. Or otherwise really bad things happen, and that would be the sort of the loss of frequency that could eventually lead to an entire collapse of the grid. So there's that interconnection, and so basically everywhere that people produce and consume in an interconnected system are going to have impacts throughout the entire system. And what's more, another important point that Lynn made was about the interconnection between two different markets. Between the fuel markets, particularly for natural gas, and the electricity market. And one thing that's important to bring out in that context is that these are regulated by different entities at both at the state level in particular, but also there's federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction, and so that's a source of interconnection in the physical system that's not necessarily reflected in an interconnection in the regulatory system, and that can be a potential source of problem. But one sort of broad lesson about interconnected complex systems, and as Lynn noted, the electricity system is incredibly complex, is something that's sometimes referred to as a normal accident. Now, you might say that's kind of a weird expression. This didn't seem that normal to me living here in Houston. That's really something of a term of art dating from back in the 1980s and 1990s when people were studying sort of the catastrophic failures in complex systems, like the failure of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, or the failure of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, and airplane crashes and things of that nature. And essentially what the conclusion of this line of research is that in these complex systems, disturbances, breakdowns in one part of the system can cause cascading problems throughout the rest of the system, and that it's very difficult to isolate the problems. What it also means is that frequently it's very difficult after the fact to really figure out what happened, what caused what, because you have, again, all of these things interacting with one another. and trying to determine what caused an entire system to fail can sometimes be very challenging. And so, taking that perspective with respect to what happened in Texas last month, I think it should lead us to have some caution, or take a sort of a cautious view about sort of diagnoses about what happened and what can be done to fix it. Sort of another takeaway from this sort of normal accidents paradigm is that, well, again, the system is so complex, and if you sort of address the issues that caused one problem in the past, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to eliminate the risk, because in a very complex system, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong, and we could run up into another problem in the future. So that's why I think that a very sort of cautious approach to evaluating what happened should be undertaken, and it's not the kind of situation in which rapid judgments are possible, and definitely are not prudent. And also, it's important not to overlearn the lessons and just think that they say, well, we've taken measures to address one problem, that really is going to eliminate the possibility of a repeat in the future. Now, so some other issues that have come up here, and this is in some of the the policy takeaways that both Peter and Lynne noted. There's been sort of immediate attempts to identify culprits, either the regulators or the lack of regulation and things of that nature. So I just want to make a few remarks about that, with a focus on sort of the basic design principle in the Texas electricity market, which makes it somewhat unique. And I agree with Lynne that it's in many respects it is has a very desirable features, and even in the aftermath of what happened in February, I would still argue that it was the best electricity design system in the world. And the crucial thing is that the Texas system relies on prices and price signals to give people incentives to invest and to maintain their plants, and to take precautions against failure. Because basically the only way you get paid if you generate electricity, or if you own generation capacity in Texas, is if you generate electricity and sell it on the market. In other markets, they don't really trust the price system to do that, and so they create other kinds of markets, so-called capacity markets, where I say, well, we don't think that just the ability to sell electricity at the market price is going to give people the appropriate incentive to invest in enough generation capacity. We might have too little capacity, and that might make the system vulnerable to a breakdown. So we're going to sort of require a certain level of investment, and then create this sort of separate kind of market to reward that kind of investment. And so some have argued that one of the problems in Texas is, this demonstrates that Texas was mistaken to rely purely on energy pricing to provide the appropriate incentives to invest in, or maintain, or provide hardening against extreme weather events. And they should have had a capacity market. And it's definitely not clear that would have made any difference at all here, because as the diagram that Lynne showed, essentially it was, even if we had more generating capacity in the form of, in particular, natural gas, that might not have been of any use, given that the fuel supply to those units was a victim of the weather. So there's a term in the energy markets, electricity markets, about capacity limited resources and energy limited resources. Capacity markets are intended to make sure we have enough capacity. Well, the problem as a result of the weather and the disruption in fuel supplies meant that this capacity became fuel limited. And so having more capacity that couldn't get fuel wouldn't have been that helpful, if helpful at all, last month. Some other interesting things here is that, a point that Lynne raised also demonstrates that, again, this sort of bifurcated nature between the way the fuel markets work in a regulated and the way that the power markets work in a regulated was one source of problems. In the sense that there was really, natural gas was not allocated by price. Right? This requirement that gas utilities essentially serve their heating customers first and are not going to, and that's going to draw gas away from supplying electricity. Well, that's sort of a constraint that prevents gas potentially from flowing to its highest value use. And so that was, an illustration of where constraints on pricing in one side of the market can have adverse impacts on other markets that are interconnected with those, and some sort of tension between allocating resources by price in one market where another related market does not use prices in the same way. Some other issues that have come up. Well, so why didn't natural gas producers winterize their facilities more? Why didn't power plants winterize their plants more? Here again, it's going to be sort of a cost-benefit issue. We know that we can winterize wells. There's lots of gas production in northern Alberta. There's gas production in Alaska. There's gas production in Siberia. So we know that we can have wells that continue to operate even when weather is really cold, but that doesn't come for free. And so you have to ask the question, well, is the additional cost that's required in order to winterize facilities like oil wells going to is there going to be a larger commensurate benefit? The key piece of information that you need to do in order to evaluate that question is, well, what's the probability we're going to have really cold weather that would cause problems with unwinterized wells in Texas? And I'm sure that that's going to be a subject of intense debate going forward. But there's also the fundamental question, well, who's going to have that information? Right? Who has the incentive to use that information? And again, sort of the whole logic behind a price system like the Texas power market, and to a considerable degree the natural gas market, is that, hey, prices are going to send the signal, and that the people that own gas wells and that own power plants have an incentive to say, hey, if I don't, if my well is not operating or my power plant is not operating when prices are really high because the weather is cold, I've lost out on a big opportunity. So if you look at a power plant that went down when the price of power was $9,000, if you had a 500 megawatt plant, every hour there's $4.5 million you didn't make. Right? And so you can say, hey, that's going to sort of get you thinking about whether you winterize the plant. And so then it's a question of whether the people with the information about what the costs are and have an incentive to sort of evaluate what the probabilities are, whether we should leave the decisions in their hands or instead delegate those kinds of decisions to regulators that might not have the same incentives and the same information. One last point, or I'll make two other points. One about interconnection, and the interconnection in some ways is pick your poison, because one thing with interconnection is that yes, if you have a problem, you can potentially draw on the resources of other systems to address your problem. On the other hand, if you're interconnected, sometimes others' problems can be inflicted on you. So for example, there have been circumstances, for example, in 2003, there was a major outage through the entire Northeast and Midwest of the United States in the interconnected power grid in that region. And so, Texas as an island is essentially immune from those sort of spillover effects. And so, again, it's not really clear what the, on net, whether you're going to be importing more solutions or importing more problems if you have an interconnected system. And sort of the last point that I want to make, and again, it relates to this price point. And it also sort of builds on what Lynne's point was about insulation and things of that nature, which is, well, again, how are you going to provide incentives for people to do things like insulate their homes or to undertake other conservation measures? Well, one way to do that, again, is to see that people, that, hey, if electricity is really expensive, but I've insulated my home and so I'm going to use less, that price signal gives people the incentive, to make those investments. And if you basically don't pass the real cost of a resource onto individual consumers, they're not going to have incentives to conserve appropriately. But one of the big problems, and we've seen this in electricity, there's a couple of companies whose customers, they entered into contracts with their retail customers that you're going to pay the wholesale price customer. And under those circumstances, that some people are going to see power bills in the tens of thousands of dollars for a few days of electricity. And that's a problem that electricity design, market design has been struggling with for years. On the one hand, how to ensure that consumers see price signals to give them incentives to conserve and to undertake investments that allow them to conserve. But on the other hand, allocate risk so that consumers aren't going to be bankrupted by an extreme event like we saw in Texas. And that's another thing to keep in mind. And one last point, because it is related to pricing, and I know that the issues of renewables has been on a lot of people's minds. A lot of stuff went wrong. Basically every generation resource underperformed during the crisis that we had. And so again, sort of focusing on wind and renewables in this episode is probably misplaced. But one thing that is, I think, pretty clear is that due to extensive subsidization of renewables, that has sent false price signals. And as a result, we probably had overinvestment in wind and underinvestment in conventional resources. And that is more likely to bite us in a hot summer than in a cold winter, but nonetheless is a problem. And it's one that's been recognized and been building for many years. So that was a little bit of looking back and also a bit of looking forward, and I look forward to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Craig. Great insights and a nice compliment to Lynne's remarks. We do have some questions, some basic questions and some rather technical questions in the chat window, but maybe I just sort of, we can discuss amongst ourselves a few other, maybe more kind of middle ground issues that might come up. So we've talked about the physical characteristics of the system. We've talked a little bit about the basics of Texas's market design. We've talked about the marginal costs and benefits, adjusting for risk of investing to sort of prevent against extreme events, a little bit about interconnection. One of the things that we heard in the days and weeks following the event was that the reason Texas is not connected to the other grids is not so much to protect us against having being affected by adverse events in neighboring areas, but so that Texas would not be subject to the same regulatory regime as the rest of the U.S. And I even remember some people somewhat snarkily responding, well, Texas likes to go its own way, and they believed in the market, quote unquote. Look what happened to them. That's the price they paid for their stubborn independence. Could each of you comment a little bit about, how would it work if we were connected to the other grids? Would ERCOT? We wouldn't have ERCOT. I guess ERCOT couldn't perform its function as a load balancer if we're also balancing loads with other grids. Is that even possible? And what would be the advantages and disadvantages from an institutional point of view? Lynn, you want to jump in first? Lynn, you're still muted.
Being a good citizen means having to pay attention. ERCOT would still exist, but so like Craig mentioned the 2003 Northeast blackout, which started in northeastern Ohio, which is in the equivalent to ERCOT in that area is called PJM. So it started in PJM, but it spread at almost the speed of light, which is what current does, to other regions. So, New York has its own equivalent of ERCOT. New England has its own equivalent of ERCOT, and they all went out too because they're interconnected. Even though from a reliability perspective and from a market platform perspective, they are separate legal entities, but they have physical interconnections. So ERCOT can still operate as ERCOT, but the physical interconnection, and I love the way Craig said this, and I'm going to steal this in the future because pick your poison is exactly right. Pick your poison is a colorful way of saying there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And the trade-off here is that, without interconnection, you can manage your grid more to, you can have more control over the physical management of what goes on in your grid. But the trade-off is when something like this happens and you want to be able to bring in supply from other grids, you can't. So there's trade-offs there. You give up some control in return for, in essence, some insurance, but it's not even necessarily insurance against, like what happened. It wouldn't have been sufficient to bring supply to Texas 2 weeks ago. The interconnection wasn't the right, wouldn't have given the right resources to be able to deal with what happened. And you can say, I don't want to engage in finger pointing, but I do think that the problem is upstream. It's much more about the interdependence with the natural gas system than it is about interconnection.
And I would agree. So, Lynn talked about economies of scale and scope. Well, it's probably unmanageable to have truly a national interconnected grid where you had one entity essentially managing the entire grid. And so we do have these various regional organizations. So there's the New York ISO, NEPOOL in New England, PJM and parts of the Midwest, MISO and the Mid-Atlantic, MISO in basically the Great Plains and areas like that. But they're interconnected, but that also creates seams where those entities have to coordinate, and that creates a lot of challenges. California, is another example. If you look back at I'm old enough to remember the California electricity crisis. And a lot of the issues involved sort of the interconnections between California, which operated its own system, and other systems throughout the West. And a lot of the gaming that went on was attempts to sort of play into these seams between the California system and the systems outside of California. So as Lynn said, it's trade-offs as opposed to trade-offs to solutions. You just basically have to choose what sort of problems that you want to deal with. And in all honesty, I think that that many of the it's simpler to manage something like ERCOT than it is to manage say the New York ISO or PJM, which is also part of a larger ecosystem of other operating entities, which are not just only in the U.S. So there's big connections with Canada, for example, and think of managing all of those relationships. So and again, in the electricity market, these things have to be done in real time. So basically, people have to be doing essentially you have to be herding these cats all at the same time and make sure that it all operates in sync. Because if it gets out of sync, then it completely goes kablooey.
So let me throw a kind of this might be a softball, but might not be. There a lot of folks, not only in this context but in other contexts, as you both know, have a sort of ambivalent appreciation for markets. That markets are good at allocating resources under sort of normal conditions, and Craig, to echo what you said, market price signals provide strong incentives for operators to make effective use of the capacity that they have and to invest in some levels of excess capacity. But many people, and of course a lot of our fellow professional academics, not to mention journalists and so forth, think that, well, but price signals and the profit motive do not provide sufficient incentives for operators, generators, and so forth to protect the public interest in some sort of broader sense. I mean, yes, of course, I'm not going to invest in winterizing my plant or my generating capacity or my energy extraction capability because it's too expensive. My shareholders won't stand for it. But the result is that the little guy, the Main Street guy, will get harmed, and that other forms of regulation, maybe capacity creating, capacity regulation or creating some kind of capacity or quasi-capacity markets, would alleviate this kind of, would protect the public interest better, even though it isn't good for, the bottom line of these private generators and transmission operators and so forth. What's the right way to think about that kind of more general limits to markets problem in a case like this?
Oh, I have thoughts. I'm not sure. I don't recall, Craig, if this is something on which you and I differ, but this is, there's a lot of heated debates. This is, we're getting back to like English Civil War type, religious divides in terms of the, energy only versus capacity market design. I think there are a couple of things that are important and really valuable and good design choices in ERCOT. One is, and this is in contrast to California, when California, back in the California crisis in 2000, 2001, ERCOT, the ERCOT managed markets, the day ahead, day of, hourly, 15-minute, so the way power markets work, it's in time intervals. So there's a day ahead market, there's an day of market that's kind of general, and then hourly, and then every 15 minutes. Much of the exchange, the economic exchange that goes on in electricity at the bulk power level in Texas happens through contracts and not through ERCOT's markets. And so like, for example, Craig mentioned wind, and one of the, there have been subsidies that put the thumb on the scale for wind, but Texas's ERCOT's market model has been just a real win for getting wind investment to happen. And I would say that that was the case even if you didn't have the federal production tax credit that put the thumb on the scale for renewables. But a lot of wind is an example of something that is called a PPA, a power purchase agreement. And so typically what happens is the parties will enter into, it could be like a retailer with a wind farm developer, or increasingly companies like Google are entering into PPAs with wind farm developers. And so they'll enter into these contracts for, and essentially that is giving a market incentive for the investment in generation capacity. And it's not happening through the spot market on ERCOT, it's happening through contracts. So, so there are other ways of organizing the transactions. And
you're saying that would happen even in the absence, no matter how the exchange market is designed, you would still have incentives for.
But what's important about ERCOT is ERCOT has really low entry barriers, right? You have credit checks, which, you know, and the typical kind of common law force and fraud stuff, but you have credit checks and, you know, certain kind of viability type things. But in general, within the kind of proper legal institutional framework, the entry barriers in ERCOT are very low. And so more investment takes place in ERCOT, all other things equal, than you really see in the other organized wholesale markets. The other thing that I think is, and I would argue in favor of ERCOT's design to stay away from the capacity construct, Peter, that you suggested, and the contrast, and in part it's because there's both a economic and environmental efficiency argument against the capacity mechanism, and there's also a political economy argument against it. The efficiency argument against it is that when you put in place a capacity mechanism, what you're basically doing is you're paying someone to build something and sink a lot of capital into it, and it's going to sit there idle 99.9% of the time. And given the alternative ways that you could deal with outage risk or deal with demand peaks, I would argue that that kind of investment these days is wasteful. That because of digitization and digital technologies and all the smart grid stuff, and the ability to automate sending a price signal directly to your thermostat, and you programming your willingness to pay into your thermostat, you know, that gives you the kind of demand flexibility. And then once we have solar panels on roofs and electric vehicles in garages, we can use those as resources to help make the grid more resilient as well, rather than sinking huge power plants and lots of capital that's going to sit there idle most of the time. So I'm very opposed to capacity mechanisms. And also the political economy. If you look at PJM, for example, in the Mid-Atlantic, right, the corporate governance of PJM, it's basically a partnership of generation companies. And so, of course, what kind of corporate governance do they institute? They institute a capacity mechanism so that they get paid for building a lot of capacity. So
it's like the old Averis Johnson effect that we used to talk about in regulation theory. By the way, just for the audience, what you mean by smart grids is something like you described, where we're using digital technology to sort of micromanage or nano manage or more manage in real time different, not only producers of electricity, ways to produce electricity, but also ways that it can be used more effectively.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, one thing about under the sort of the traditional way, like demand curves are like totally inelastic because consumers don't see the price signals. And so by smart grids and smart metering and things of that nature, you can get information about prices, and people can basically make decisions in advance. Hey, how do I want to cut my consumption when price goes up? And again, it's another aspect of seeing the prices.
Yeah, but just to play devil's advocate, do you think there's kind of a cultural, change in mindset that is required. Maybe like you guys, I sort of chuckled to myself when, at the beginning of that week, we were all getting communications from our local utility providers, from the municipal water provider. Please don't stock up on water. Don't fill your bathtub with water. Don't be hoarding water now because you're worried that your pipes might break and you'll need water later. We all need to conserve water. You need to run less water now just in case. And the economist in the room says, well, why don't they just increase the price of water and get people to conserve that way? But that strikes many people as, at best infeasible, at worst, monstrously immoral. How would you go about, getting people to what's the right way to make more effective use of the price mechanism in a way that is politically feasible and sort of culturally acceptable?
Well, that I sort of touched on that one of my last remarks, which is that it's very difficult because particularly in electricity markets where price extremes are not that unusual, where something that normally sells for 20 might sell for 9,000. And so it's a very, on the one hand, from an incentive perspective, to give people an incentive to consume properly, hey, you would want to price those price signals through. But from a risk-bearing perspective, individuals, particularly lower middle income individuals, they're not in an efficient position to bear that risk. And so we would like to insulate them from that risk. What does that mean? Well, that they don't see the real market price. And so that's, I think, one of the real difficult challenges. And also, what we're seeing playing out in Texas right now is another issue, is that whether it's credible to have consumers pay the actual price. Because what we're seeing is that, okay, hey, we should have clawbacks that the generators should have to pay back some of the money. Some of the Lynne mentioned power plants or renewables facilities, and some of those that entered into contracts where they were obligated to sell a certain amount of power, and if they didn't, they were required to basically pay out at the prevailing market price. They're putting a tremendous amount of political pressure, and so it's also uncertain as to whether a true price system is credible, in the sense that you think that those prices are really going to end up being paid and received in the event.
Yeah, I guess it's like if you anticipate price gouging restrictions to come into play, then it doesn't really work the way it's advertised. By the way, I want to remind our audience members that you can type questions into the Q&A window. I especially want to encourage students to do so. Don't hold back your questions, however off the wall they might seem. For these expert panelists, let's take advantage of the opportunity to grill them a little bit. While we're waiting for more questions, let me ask each of you if you could say something about innovation and entrepreneurship, which is a major focus of our center here at Baylor. One of the criticisms of the traditional regulated market is that it provides few incentives or even disincentives for firms to come up with new and better ways, more efficient ways to produce the good or service in question. Do you think that the way the Texas market is currently designed does provide adequate incentives for entrepreneurs to come up with new technologies, whether they be, hydrogen fuel cells or greater reliance on safer forms of nuclear energy, or something that really is very different from what we're doing now?
Battery storage. Yes. ERCOT is one of the hot spots, so to speak, which is a really ironic and sad thing for me to say given what we're talking about, but in terms of battery investment and storage investment, right? And if you think about it, and I said before that I think the ERCOT market design has been instrumental in encouraging the development of wind and investment in wind technologies. I think the the kind of subsidies that Craig alluded to muddy the price signal. And so it's I think one of the most important criticisms that we have about market design and regulatory policy and energy is that a lot of the things that we do mess with the price signal, and so we end up with unintended consequences and bad outcomes because we've messed with the price signal, and we forget the fact that prices are meant to be meaningful pieces of communicating meaningful pieces of knowledge that can't be aggregated or acquired in any other way. So with all of that throat clearing about the production tax credit for wind, yeah, we've messed with the price signal, but ERCOT has messed with the price signal less than other organized wholesale markets in the US. And the other thing that that I would say in favor of ERCOT's, the Texas approach was back in the mid 2000s when wind, when the production cost of wind turbines was really starting to fall. And so wind was becoming more economical as an investment. Part of the challenge in Texas, of course, is where is it mostly windy? Up in the Panhandle and in West Texas. Where do people live? Not in the Panhandle and not so much in West Texas. So how do you get the wind from here to there? You need to build transmission. And the Public Utility Commission, I would give the credit for this, but in conjunction with ERCOT, they did a project called CREZ, C-R-E-Z, and I don't remember what it stands for. Something like creating renewable energy zones. But the idea was look at what's going on in ERCOT. And ERCOT has, the way power markets work is you have basically different nodes in the system, and there are prices at different nodes, although at the time it was in zones, not nodes. But you can see if there's different market clearing prices in different regions around the state, that one thing that can indicate to you is that there's a transmission congestion, right? So if there's a lot of wind in West Texas and it can't get to Dallas, there's going to be really low prices in West Texas and really high prices around Dallas. If you could build a transmission line to better connect West Texas with, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, you can get more convergence of prices across systems and get more wind power to more places and get cheaper prices, especially overnight, because the marginal cost of wind is approximately zero. But what they did was they used those negative prices as an indication of where they should build the transmission lines. And so they said, okay, prices are informative. Prices convey knowledge. Let's use that knowledge to tell us where we need to build these wires. And now that I've kind of gone down memory lane on CREZ, I've kind of lost the train of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So
yeah, right on it.
Yeah. But now, so what happened in wind, now we are seeing there's so much wind, but wind only blows at certain times of the day. Wind forecasting has gotten really good. So we generally have a good sense of when the wind is and isn't going to show up, but it doesn't always blow when we want it. And so battery storage is a nice complement to wind and solar. And because of what's going on with wind and because of this high $9,000 a megawatt hour price cap that's in ERCOT, those prices, market clearing prices, can go high enough, and there's a market opportunity there for investors to invest in storage. And so we're seeing a lot of battery. Just last week, Tesla announced they're building a big 150 megawatt, I think, battery in Texas to help, and that will help make the grid more resilient in the face of these kind of events.
Just to be clear, do we have the technology now such that if electricity prices spike, in principle, I could plug my Tesla into the grid and not drive it and suck all of, just basically drain my battery and get paid for it. But yep. we don't have the institutional setup just yet, but in principle that's doable.
Yes, we have bidirectional. Tesla has enabled, and I don't know, I don't have a Tesla, but I know from friends who do have Tesla that you can buy like various add-on things. So you get this package or that package or the other package. One thing that they've enabled, even though the regulatory system is not really ready for it yet, is bidirectional charging, so that you could sell to other people from the energy stored in your battery, and you can also buy and basically automate the charging of your vehicle. I also know, in 2 weeks ago during the freeze, I saw an article about some people who have electric vehicles, and they were using their batteries in their cars to run their houses.
Craig, what do you think?
Well, so I was going to make a remark about innovation, particularly in the financial sphere, which people might not be as familiar with. Lynne touched on a little bit when she talked about power pricing agreements, PPAs. But there's been a lot of innovation in terms of financial contracting to allow people to allocate risk more efficiently. And there are a lot of different kinds of risks in the power market. Yes, there are price risks, but there are also obviously weather-related risks. And there's been a tremendous amount of innovation in that area. Not necessarily people in the backs of their garages coming up with these things, but financial institutions designing products that allow more effective management of these sorts of risks. Earlier today, this is my panel day. Earlier today, I was on a panel about weather derivatives in the liquefied natural gas market, and basically talking about some of the kinds of very customized products that companies can utilize to manage risk, the price risks, the quantity risks, so that's been an area of innovation which probably flies under most people's radar, but it is an important way of lowering cost and encouraging more investment, because hey, I can manage the risks associated with this investment. I'm likely to be able to invest more.
Great point. So we're coming up on the end of our time. Lynne, do you have any additional remarks you'd like to make, or a brief closing statement for posterity? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, trying to be a good citizen. I would, again, emphasize the fact that this is an interdependence of systems question, and that there's been a lot of the kind of finger pointing and blaming, and people have resigned from ERCOT, and people have resigned from the PUC. But I think the real question is, and it's a public policy question, and it's also, I think, a political cultural question of how much political will is there to grapple with these interdependencies in systems. And I think that's the real challenge, is to not go for the monocausal explanations, but think about the system interdependency. And I'm just nervous that there's not going to be much political will for doing reasonable, prudent, sensible, not too expensive kind of institutional evolution is, I think, the word I'm going to use.
Yeah, and you did say you would support programs that would help to alleviate the burden on particular households, weatherization of homes, or providing emergency relief, something like that.
I think low-income energy low-income energy assistance is the Achilles heel of the regulatory system in electricity. It's badly done, and even with millions of dollars of subsidies that go to agencies to go out and do weatherization in low-income housing, it gets spent badly. And I think there's a lot of room there for improvement. But that's my kind of utopian optimist. The political economist in me still has to ask how feasible it is to achieve that. But I think it's a good goal.
Okay, thank you. Craig, any fingers to point?
No. So I sort of related to Lynne's last point, I'm always reminded of a remark by Lily Tomlin. We try to be cynical, but it's hard to keep up. So I was going to sort of mesh things together, because Lynne had the very important point, that we have to think about this from a system-wide perspective. And what we really have here is a huge coordination problem, and a very complex coordination problem, where we have to coordinate things on the timescales of seconds and decades. And then the question is, how do you get that coordination? And the price system is one way of getting coordination. Some sort of more direct command and control is other ways of getting coordination. And that's the big, sort of debate about what's the appropriate mix in something as complex as the electricity system. And it's been an issue that people have been grappling with for going on 30 years now. And I think that's, framing the things that way I think will help people make better decisions.
Excellent. Well, that's great closing points by both of you. So once again, let me thank all of you for being here tonight. Let me thank our participants again, Lynne Kiesling and Craig Pirrong. Let me also thank Kathy Carr, the organizer of this event, and encourage all of you to visit our website. Again, it's just search for Baylor Free Enterprise, or you can type into your browser baylor.edu/business/free enterprise. And eventually the recording of this event will be on our YouTube page, and you can see recordings of previous free enterprise forums and other events as well. So once again, thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to our generous sponsors as well. So good night, everybody.
All right, thank you.